The morning light comes late to Avignon in winter. When it finally arrives, it slides across the Rhône in pale bands, catching first on the broken arches of the Saint-Benazet Bridge, then climbing the limestone cliffs where the city rises like a clenched fist. At the summit, dominating everything, stands the Palace of the Popes, a mountain of stone so vast it seems less built than carved from the earth itself. The walls glow golden in certain conditions, almost warm, almost welcoming. But step closer into the shadow of those walls, and the temperature drops. The stone here is cold even in summer. It absorbs heat and gives back nothing. This is not a palace designed for comfort. It was designed to endure. On this particular January morning in 1342, a stonemason named Guillaume stands at the base of the eastern tower, his breath visible in the pre-dawn darkness. His hands are already bleeding. They bleed most mornings now. The limestone dust works into every crack in the skin, mixing with sweat and the lime from the mortar, creating a paste that burns and will not wash away. He has been working on this palace for 3 years. He will work for 5 more. He will never see the rooms he is helping to create. He will never walk the grand staircases or stand beneath the painted vaults. His entire world is this section of wall, these particular stones, the rhythm of the mallet against the chisel, the incremental rising of something so large it has no comprehensible end. Guillaume is one of approximately 800 laborers working on the palace at any given time during the peak construction years. 800 men whose names history did not bother to preserve. They came from the surrounding countryside, from Lyon, from as far as Marseille, drawn by the promise of steady wages in a century that offered very little certainty. They arrived to find a construction site unlike anything Europe had seen since the great cathedrals. But this was no cathedral. Cathedrals reach toward heaven. This palace plants itself on earth like a conqueror's boot. The Palace of the Popes occupies 15,000 square meters. Its walls rise to heights of 50 meters in places, constructed from massive limestone blocks, each weighing several hundred kilograms, quarried from the hillsides east of the city and dragged by oxen and human muscle up roads that collapsed under the weight. The palace contains more than 20 towers, each a fortress unto itself. The grand chapel alone could swallow most parish churches whole. Its interior volume spans 75 meters in length, 15 in width, and rises 20 meters to a ribbed vault that required wooden scaffolding so extensive that half the forests around Avignon were stripped to provide the timber. But numbers, however staggering, convey only dimension, not presence. To understand the palace, you must understand what it feels like to stand in the courtyard as the sun disappears behind the western wall, plunging everything into premature twilight. You must feel the way sound behaves here, voices swallowed or strangely amplified depending on where you stand, footsteps echoing off stone so hard it rings like struck metal. This is architecture as psychological force. Every corridor, every vaulted ceiling, every massive door reinforced with iron was designed to remind anyone who entered that they stood in the presence of ultimate earthly authority. The Pope who lived here was not merely Christ's representative. In this place, at this moment in history, he was attempting to become something more, a sovereign, a prince, a power that could rival kings. The man responsible for this transformation was neither a king nor a conqueror in the traditional sense. Benedict XII came to the papacy in 1334 as Jacques Fournier, a Cistercian monk who had built his reputation on theological rigor and an almost fanatical devotion to orthodoxy. He had served as an inquisitor in the Languedoc, rooting out the last remnants of Cathar heresy with the methodical patience of a man who believed absolutely in his own righteousness. He was not charismatic. He did not inspire devotion through warmth or pastoral care. What he inspired was fear and respect for his intellect, and a grudging acknowledgement that he could not be bought, could not be swayed, could not be moved from what he believed to be the correct path. When Benedict surveyed the existing papal residence in Avignon, a modest episcopal palace that his predecessor had rented, essentially camping in someone else's house, he saw intolerable weakness. The papacy had fled Rome in 1309, driven out by factional violence and political chaos that made the eternal city ungovernable. For 2 decades, the popes had lived in Avignon like refugees, guests of the French crown, dependent on borrowed buildings and local goodwill. Benedict understood that perception shapes reality. A pope who lives in rented rooms is a pope diminished. To restore the papacy's authority, he needed a physical manifestation of power so overwhelming that no king, no emperor, no merchant prince could stand before it and question who ruled Christendom. The palace Benedict envisioned would cost approximately 300,000 florins to construct in its initial phase, a sum that represented roughly 1/3 of the papacy's annual income at the time. To put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn 30 florins per year. A minor noble could live comfortably on 200. 300,000 florins was the kind of money that could finance a war, ransom a king, or build an entire city. And this was only the beginning. His successor, Clement VI, would spend another 300,000 florins expanding the palace into the sprawling complex that exists today. Where did the money come from? The simple answer is that it came from everywhere. The medieval papacy operated the most sophisticated financial system in Europe, a network of collectors, bankers, and administrators that reached into every diocese, every monastery, every parish church on the continent. Bishops paid annates, essentially a year's income from their diocese, upon appointment. Benefices, the ecclesiastical positions that generated income, were bought and sold with the papacy taking a substantial cut of every transaction. There were tithes, Peter's pence, fees for dispensations, fees for absolutions, fees for appointments, fees for confirmations, fees for nearly everything the church provided or controlled. The papal treasury also engaged in what we would now recognize as financial speculation, lending money at interest through intermediaries, investing in trade ventures, and manipulating currency exchanges to generate profit. But money is only useful if it can be transformed into stone and labor. The logistics of constructing the Palace of the Popes required an administrative apparatus as complex as the financial one. Someone had to negotiate with quarry owners for the limestone. Someone had to organize the transportation of timber from forests 50 kilometers away. Someone had to recruit and manage hundreds of masons, carpenters, plasterers, and laborers. Someone had to coordinate the delivery of lead for the roofing, iron for the doors and window grills, glass for the windows, a luxury so expensive that only the most important chambers received it, the rest making do with shutters or oiled parchment. This is where the invisible architecture of the palace begins to emerge. Beneath the grand halls and painted chapels, there existed a parallel world of basements and storage vaults, kitchens and workshops, servant quarters and stables. The palace required this hidden infrastructure just to function. The kitchens alone occupied an entire wing of the lower level, equipped with ovens large enough to roast whole oxen, storage rooms for grain and oil and wine, a pantry system sophisticated enough to provision a household that could swell to several thousand people during major ecclesiastical gatherings. Heating such a structure presented challenges that bordered on the impossible. Medieval heating technology relied on fireplaces, and the palace contains more than 40 of them, each requiring a constant supply of wood. A single fireplace consuming wood at a moderate rate could burn through several cords in a winter month. Multiply that by 40, and you begin to understand the scale of consumption. Forests around Avignon that had stood for centuries were systematically harvested to keep the papal chambers warm. When local supplies proved insufficient, Wood had to be transported from increasingly distant sources, adding transportation costs to an already staggering fuel bill. Water presented another seemingly insurmountable problem. The palace sits atop a rocky outcrop with no natural water source. Every drop had to be carried up from the Rhone or from wells in the lower city. For drinking water, washing, cooking, the latrines, the gardens, all of it hauled bucket by bucket up narrow stairs by servants whose labor was so fundamental to the palace's operation that it became invisible. The truly wealthy never think about water. They turn a tap, fill a basin, and never consider the human effort required to make that simple act possible. The construction itself was a daily negotiation with physics and human endurance. The limestone blocks that form the palace walls weigh between 200 and 500 kilograms each. Moving them from quarry to construction site required teams of oxen, specialized carts built to withstand the weight, and roads maintained at considerable expense. Once at the site, the blocks had to be lifted into place using wooden cranes powered by tread wheels, large wheels that men walked inside like hamsters, their body weight providing the mechanical advantage needed to hoist stone 40 meters into the air. Accidents were routine. Ropes frayed and snapped, scaffolding collapsed, men fell from towers, were crushed beneath stones, developed respiratory diseases from the constant inhalation of limestone dust. There are no records of how many died building the Palace of the Popes, but medieval construction sites were lethal places. Safety regulations did not exist. Workers who became too injured to continue were simply replaced. The wage of a laborer, typically 3 to 5 pennies per day, barely covered food and lodging. Injury meant destitution. Death often meant an unmarked grave. The masons represented the aristocracy of the construction workforce, skilled craftsmen who could read architectural drawings, understand the principles of load-bearing and thrust, and transform rough stone into precisely fitted blocks. They were paid better than laborers, sometimes 10 to 15 pennies per day, and they knew their worth. Guilds protected their knowledge, ensuring that expertise remained scarce and valuable. A master mason working on the palace would have spent years as an apprentice, learning not just how to cut stone, but how to read the stone, to understand which blocks would bear weight and which would crack, where to place the chisel to make the stone split along its natural grain, rather than shatter uselessly. Benedict XII did not live to see his palace completed. He died in 1342, 8 years into the construction, with the core structure finished but much of the interior still bare stone. His successor, Clement VI, was Benedict's opposite in almost every respect. Where Benedict had been austere and disciplined, Clement was extravagant, a lover of art and luxury and spectacle. He looked at Benedict's fortress and saw not a symbol of strength, but a canvas waiting for transformation. Clement VI understood that power operates on multiple registers. Physical intimidation was one, certainly. The massive walls and defensive towers sent a clear message. But there was another kind of power and beauty in the demonstration of such refined taste and unlimited resources that observers could only marvel and despair of ever matching it. Clement brought artists from across Europe to decorate the palace. The most famous was Matteo Giovannetti, an Italian painter who spent years covering the walls and vaults with frescoes depicting biblical scenes, saints, prophets, and elaborate decorative patterns in brilliant blues derived from lapis lazuli, a pigment so expensive it had to be imported from Afghanistan at costs that rivaled gold. The pigment supply chain alone tells a story about medieval globalization and the hidden costs of beauty. Lapis lazuli began as stone extracted from mines in the Badakhshan region, transported along the Silk Road through Central Asia, sold to Venetian merchants who shipped it across the Mediterranean to Marseille, from where it traveled up the Rhone to Avignon. Each transfer point added costs. By the time it reached Giovannetti's workshop, A single pound of ultramarine blue pigment might cost more than a craftsman's annual salary. The blue in those frescoes, still visible today after nearly 7 centuries, represents not just artistic vision, but a global economic system and the labor of miners, traders, and sailors whose names will never be recorded. Gold leaf, another essential component of the palace's decoration, came with its own cascade of hidden labor. Gold had to be beaten into sheets so thin that a single ounce could cover several square meters. This work was done by gold beaters, skilled artisans who spent hours hammering gold between sheets of vellum, creating leaf approximately 1/10,000th of a millimeter thick. The room where this work happened had to be sealed against drafts. A single breath of wind could scatter a day's work irretrievably. The gold leaf was then carefully applied to prepared surfaces, adhered with mixtures of clay and egg white, burnished to a reflective shine that made painted surfaces seem to emit their own light. Clement's expansion of the palace added the new palace to Benedict's old palace, nearly doubling the size of the complex. The new palace included the Grand Chapel, the Grand Audience Hall, additional towers, expanded living quarters for the papal household, and more elaborate defensive works. The cost, as mentioned, approached another 300,000 florins, but this figure represents only direct construction expenses. The ongoing operational costs dwarf the initial investment. Running the Palace of the Popes required a staff that numbered in the hundreds even during quiet periods. The papal household included chamberlains, secretaries, legal advisors, financial officers, chaplains, confessors, physicians, astrologers, scribes, messengers, guards, cooks, bakers, wine stewards, stable masters, grooms, laundresses, seamstresses, musicians, and an army of general servants whose duties ranged from lighting candles to emptying chamber pots. Each of these positions represented a salary, and salaries had to be paid in currency that held value, which required the constant conversion of tithes and fees collected in hundreds of different local currencies into usable form. The palace guard alone numbered approximately 200 men during the Avignon papacy's peak. These were not ceremonial positions. 14th century Avignon was a violent place, a city that had grown too quickly, swollen with petitioners, merchants, bankers, prostitutes, criminals, and the desperate poor drawn by the wealth concentrated in the papal court. Armed robbery was common. Factional violence between Italian banking families occasionally spilled into street fighting. The palace required real security, which meant professional soldiers who expected regular pay, equipment, and provisions. Food costs represented one of the largest ongoing expenses. The papal table was expected to demonstrate magnificence, and medieval magnificence was measured in quantity and rarity. Recipes from the period describe meals of 8 or 10 courses, each course containing multiple dishes. A single banquet might feature swans, peacocks, herons, whole roasted boar, elaborate pies containing dozens of small birds, subtleties, sculptural food displays made from marzipan and sugar, exotic spices imported at tremendous cost from Asia. The wine cellars of the palace could store thousands of barrels. Clement VI's wine consumption alone was legendary, averaging several liters per day of the finest vintages the Rhone Valley could produce. But perhaps the most overlooked cost was parchment and paper. The administrative apparatus of the papacy generated documents constantly: bulls, briefs, letters, legal rulings, financial accounts, inventories. Each document required vellum, or, increasingly, paper imported from Italy. A single sheet of quality vellum required the skin of one calf or sheep, properly treated, scraped, and prepared, a process that took days and required specialized knowledge. The palace employed dozens of scribes working full-time simply to keep up with the documentary demands of papal administration. This brings us to a crucial understanding. The Palace of the Popes was never just a building. It was a machine for projecting power, and like any machine, it consumed resources at a prodigious rate. The palace demanded constant feeding: wood, food, wine, candles, fabric, metal, labor, money. It could never rest. Even when the popes were absent, the palace required maintenance. Roofs leaked, stones cracked in frost, mortar weakened, timbers rotted, paint faded. Tapestries needed cleaning and repair. The machine had to be kept running or it would begin immediately to fail. The financial model that sustained this consumption depended on the Church's position as Europe's dominant landowner and spiritual authority. The papacy collected income from properties scattered across the continent: farms, vineyards, mills, entire villages. Each property generated rents, and rents required management, which required administrators, which created additional costs. The system worked only as long as the flow of income remained steady and the papacy's spiritual authority remained unquestioned. The first serious crisis came in 1348, though its roots had nothing to do with palace finances. The Black Death arrived in Avignon in March of that year, carried from Marseille by traders who noticed the swellings and fever too late. The plague burned through the city with horrifying speed. Within weeks, hundreds were dying daily. The Rhone became clogged with corpses thrown from the bridges because gravediggers could not keep pace with the dead. Pope Clement VI barricaded himself inside the palace, surrounded by physicians who prescribed sitting between enormous fires. The heat, they believed, would purify the air. Clement survived, though half his household did not. The plague's impact on the palace was both immediate and long-lasting. Construction stopped, workers fled or died. The supply chains that brought food and materials to Avignon collapsed as villages were depopulated and trade routes became death sentences. When the plague finally burned itself out, having killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, the world that emerged was fundamentally different. Labor was suddenly scarce and expensive. Workers who had been desperate for any employment now commanded higher wages because there were not enough of them to meet demand. Landowners found their income plummeting as fields went unworked and tenants simply disappeared. For the papacy, the plague meant a dramatic reduction in revenue exactly when expenses remained fixed. The palace still needed to be heated, staffed, and maintained, but the income to support it had been cut by 1/3 or more. This forced adjustments. Staff levels were reduced, construction projects were postponed, maintenance was deferred. The machine could not be shut down, but it could be run at reduced capacity, and the consequences of that decision would compound over time. Political crisis followed economic crisis. The Avignon papacy had always existed in an awkward relationship with the French crown. The popes were theoretically independent spiritual leaders, but they lived on French soil, depended on French protection, and were often French themselves. This created the appearance, and often the reality, of papal subservience to French political interests. When the Church finally attempted to return to Rome in 1377, it triggered a schism that would last nearly 40 years. There were suddenly 2 popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, each claiming legitimacy, each demanding obedience, each collecting taxes from the territories that recognized their authority. The schism devastated papal finances. Income was cut in half as Europe divided its loyalties. The Palace of the Popes, designed to house the undisputed leader of Christendom, became the residence of a pope whose authority was contested. Maintaining the fiction of legitimacy required maintaining the appearance of power, which meant the palace had to continue operating at full magnificence even as revenue collapsed. This was financially unsustainable, but abandoning the palace would have been an admission of defeat. The solution was borrowing. The Avignon popes began taking loans from Italian banking houses, the Medici, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, at interest rates that would have made a modern loan shark blush. 20% was common, 30% not unusual. The loans were secured against future revenues, which meant the papacy was mortgaging its own authority, promising tithes and fees not yet collected to pay for present expenses. This worked as long as future revenues materialized. When they did not, when collections fell short because of plague or war or simple administrative breakdown, the debt compounded. By the early 15th century, the palace of the popes was consuming more in maintenance and operational costs than the Avignon papacy could reasonably afford. The schism ended in 1417 with the Council of Constance, which deposed all competing popes and elected Martin V, who ruled from Rome. Avignon was finished as the seat of papal power. The palace that had been designed to embody ultimate authority became an administrative backwater, home to a papal legate and a much-reduced staff. This began the palace's long, slow transformation from active seat of power to historical relic. Without the papal court, Avignon lost much of its purpose. The merchants and bankers departed, the population declined. The palace, however, remained, still requiring care, still demanding resources, now without the revenues that had justified its construction. It became a burden, a magnificent burden, but a burden nonetheless. The solution, repeated across European history in hundreds of similar cases, was to extract value in whatever way possible. The palace was rented out, rooms used for storage, halls converted to workshops. Portions of the frescoes were whitewashed over to create clean surfaces for more utilitarian purposes. Lead was stripped from roofs to be melted down and sold. Furniture and tapestries were auctioned off. The palace was being slowly cannibalized, its value consumed to pay for its own existence. During the French Revolution, the palace was seized as state property and repurposed as a barracks and prison. Soldiers quartered in the Grand Chapel carved graffiti into the frescoed walls. Prisoners held in the towers scratched desperate messages into the stone. Furniture was burned for heat. The wine cellars were emptied. What the revolution did not destroy, it degraded through simple indifference. Revolutionary ideology had no use for monuments to papal authority. The palace was, at best, a useful building that happened to exist. Its historical and artistic value were irrelevant. It was during this period that we can see most clearly the essential fragility of such monuments. Without active care, informed by knowledge of materials and techniques, a medieval palace begins to fail rapidly. Water penetration is the primary enemy. Rain finds cracks in mortar, seeps into joints, freezes, expands, and widens the cracks. The process repeats with every winter, every storm. Timbers supporting roofs decay when moisture accumulates. Stone begins to spall and crumble. Paint flakes away. Within decades, without intervention, a building that took generations to construct can become structurally unsound. The Palace of the Pope survived the Revolution not because of any deliberate preservation effort, but largely through accident. Its massive construction, those impossibly thick walls, the quality of the limestone, the sheer overbuilt solidity of the structure, meant that even decades of neglect could not bring it down. By the time 19th century Romanticism rediscovered medieval architecture as worthy of preservation, the palace was in desperate condition, but still standing. The restoration that began in the mid-19th century was driven by a historically novel idea that buildings possessed value beyond their immediate utility. This concept, that we might spend money to preserve something simply because it is old and beautiful and connects us to the past, would have been nearly incomprehensible to medieval people. Buildings were tools to be used, modified, or demolished as needs changed. The Romantic movement transformed old buildings into heritage, and heritage, it turned out, could be monetized in new ways. Tourism emerged as the economic model that would save the palace, though save is perhaps too strong a word. Tourism allowed the palace to justify its existence by transforming it into a commodity. Visitors would pay to walk through the rooms, to marvel at the frescoes, to stand in the grand chapel and imagine popes and cardinals processing an elaborate ceremony. This required restoration work to make the palace presentable, which required expertise that barely existed. Medieval construction techniques had been largely forgotten. The materials and methods used by 14th century craftsmen were mysteries that had to be painstakingly rediscovered. The first major restoration efforts, undertaken in the 1860s and 1870s, were well-intentioned but often misguided. Restorers filled in missing sections of fresco with their own paintings, creating a jarring mixture of medieval and Victorian art. Stones were replaced with materials that weathered differently than the originals. Iron reinforcements were installed that would later corrode and cause new damage. We cannot judge these early restores too harshly. They were inventing the field of architectural conservation as they worked. But their mistakes would create problems for future generations. The 20th century brought mechanized warfare twice to Europe, and while Avignon was not heavily bombed, the palace suffered from the general chaos and resource scarcity of both world wars. Maintenance was again deferred, staff levels dropped to skeleton crews, the palace endured, but endurance came at a cost measured in cumulative small degradations. After World War II, as Europe began to rebuild, the concept of cultural heritage gained institutional support. UNESCO, founded in 1945, would eventually designate the historic center of Avignon, including the Palace of the Popes, as a World Heritage Site in 1995. This designation carried prestige but also obligations. World Heritage Sites are supposed to be maintained to certain standards, preserved for future generations, accessible to the public. All of this requires money. The modern Palace of the Popes operates as what is essentially a museum and event space, managed by the city of Avignon with support from regional and national cultural agencies. It receives approximately 600,000 visitors per year, each paying an entrance fee of approximately €12. Simple mathematics suggests this generates about €7 million annually in ticket revenue. This sounds substantial until you consider the costs. The palace employs a permanent staff of approximately 60 people, including administrators, security guards, ticket sellers, guides, and maintenance workers. Personnel costs alone consume several million euros annually. Climate control, necessary to preserve the surviving frescoes, requires sophisticated systems that must maintain precise temperature and humidity levels while operating in a structure never designed for such technology. The electrical bill runs into hundreds of thousands of euros per year. Conservation is an ongoing battle against entropy. Stone continues to deteriorate. In recent years, entire sections of exterior walls have required intervention, with damaged blocks carefully removed, new stone carved to match, and the whole area remortared using lime-based mortars that approximate medieval formulations. This work is extraordinarily expensive, requiring specialists with knowledge of traditional techniques. A single section of wall might cost 100,000 euros to properly restore, and the palace has thousands of square meters of exterior walls. The frescoes present their own challenges. Medieval pigments respond poorly to modern environmental conditions. Air pollution, even in a relatively small city like Avignon, contains sulfur compounds that react with pigments, causing colors to fade or darken. Conservators must periodically clean and stabilize the frescoes using techniques that remove pollutants without damaging the paint layers beneath. This is work done millimeter by millimeter, sometimes taking years to complete a single room. Water infiltration remains the primary existential threat. Despite modern roofing materials and sophisticated drainage systems, water still finds ways in. Freeze-thaw cycles still crack stone. When major restoration of the roof was undertaken in the early 2000s, the cost exceeded €5 million, and that addressed only the most critical sections. The palace requires this level of intervention approximately every 20 years, meaning that major restoration expenses must be continuously planned for and funded. Tourism revenue covers only a portion of operational costs. The remainder comes from government subsidies, private donations, and commercial activities. The palace rents its spaces for events, concerts during the Avignon festival, corporate functions, weddings. A courtyard wedding at the Palace of the Popes might cost €20,000 for the venue alone. This commercialization makes some preservationists uncomfortable. The palace was not built to be a wedding venue, but commercialization generates revenue that pays for conservation, creating a practical, if philosophically complicated arrangement. There is also EU cultural funding, competitive grants for heritage preservation, partnerships with universities conducting research on medieval construction techniques. The palace has become a node in a vast network of heritage management. Its survival depended on maintaining relationships with multiple funding sources, each with its own requirements and priorities. The staff who work in the palace today are the latest iteration of the invisible laborers who have always sustained it. The security guards who walk the same corridors that Guillaume the stonemason helped build, monitoring tourists, watching for vandalism, enduring the cold that seeps from the stones even in summer. The conservators who spend their days in intimate contact with frescoes 7 centuries old, their work demanding patience and precision that would have impressed the medieval craftsmen. The administrators who manage budgets and grant applications, negotiating the bureaucratic complexity that is the modern equivalent of managing medieval tithes and taxes. What has changed is the nature of the transaction. Medieval laborers built the palace for wages that barely sustained life, creating glory for an institution that viewed them as expendable. Modern workers are better paid, better protected, but they too are caught in a system larger than themselves. The palace must be preserved. Heritage must be protected. Tourism must be accommodated. These imperatives are presented as self-evident goods, and in many ways they are, but they create their own forms of pressure and obligation. The question of why we preserve such places admits no simple answer. There is educational value, certainly. The palace teaches us about medieval politics, architecture, art, daily life. There is economic value in tourism, jobs created, revenue generated. There is aesthetic value in beauty preserved. But beneath these justifications runs something more fundamental and harder to articulate, a sense that destroying such a place would represent a kind of cultural suicide, a severing of connection to the past that would diminish us in ways we might not fully understand until it was too late. Yet, preservation is not a neutral act. It requires choosing what to preserve and how to preserve it. The Palace of the Popes that visitors see today is not the palace as it existed in the 14th century. It is a restored, interpreted, curated version with missing elements filled in or left empty, with explanatory signage and gift shops and accessibility ramps. This is preservation as active reconstruction, as constant negotiation between historical authenticity and present needs. Climate change adds a new dimension of uncertainty. Rising temperatures and more extreme weather patterns threaten medieval structures in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Limestone that has weathered 800 years of normal Mediterranean climate may not survive the next century of increasingly violent storms, extended droughts, and temperature extremes. Conservation strategies developed over decades may need to be entirely reconceived. The costs are likely to increase substantially. There is also the question of purpose. The palace of the popes no longer serves the function for which it was built. It is not a seat of power, not a residence, not a fortress. It is a museum of itself, a monument to its own history. This transformation fundamentally alters its meaning. A palace that exists to demonstrate power becomes, when that power is gone, something else. A memorial, a tourist attraction, an architectural document. The people who pay for this preservation are, in a sense, everyone and no one. Government funding comes from taxes collected from citizens who may never visit Avignon. EU grants pool resources from dozens of countries. Ticket revenue comes from tourists from around the world. The cost is distributed so widely that it becomes invisible, much like the original construction costs were invisible to medieval Christians who paid tithes without necessarily understanding where the money went. We have replaced one invisible system with another, different in mechanics, but similar in effect. And yet, the palace endures. 7 centuries after Benedict XII laid the first stones, the fortress he built to embody papal authority still stands, still dominates the Avignon skyline, still inspires awe in those who stand before it. This endurance is not accidental and not automatic. It is the result of continuous human effort, of decisions made and remade across generations, of resources allocated and labor performed. Guillaume the stonemason died sometime in the 1350s. The records do not say when or how. Perhaps the plague took him. Perhaps he simply wore out, his body broken by years of heavy labor. He would have been buried in an unmarked grave, mourned briefly by family and forgotten by everyone else. The stones he cut and placed remain in the palace walls, indistinguishable now from all the other stones. His contribution was real but anonymous, essential but invisible. The same is true of the thousands of others who built and maintained and preserved the palace across 7 centuries. Their names are mostly lost, their individual stories unrecorded. What remains is the collective product of their labor, this vast stone monument that we inherit, admire, and struggle to preserve. The central question posed at the outset was, who truly paid for this dream, and what does it cost to keep it alive? The answer unfolds across multiple registers. Medieval peasants paid in tithes extracted from subsistence-level incomes. Laborers paid in broken bodies and shortened lives. Forests paid in their own destruction. Entire local ecosystems were altered to provide materials. In the modern era, taxpayers pay through subsidies they may not know exist. Conservators pay in careers devoted to meticulous, often thankless work. Future generations will pay in ways we cannot yet fully anticipate as climate change and economic pressures create new challenges. But there is also a philosophical answer. Great monuments to human ambition always cost more than money. They cost the prioritization of one value over others. The resources that built the Palace of the Popes might have built hospitals, roads, schools, infrastructure that would have improved countless lives. Benedict XII chose differently. He chose to make a statement in stone, to create something that would endure long after he was dust, to claim a kind of immortality through architecture. We, inheriting that choice, make our own choices. We decide that the palace is worth preserving, that the cost is justified, that beauty and history and cultural continuity matter enough to warrant the expense. These are value judgments, not inevitable conclusions. We could let the palace crumble. It would take a century or two, but entropy would reclaim it. We choose not to. We choose to maintain it, to study it, to interpret it, to open it to visitors, to fund its preservation. This choice binds us to the past in ways both profound and troubling. We become caretakers of ambitions not our own, preservers of monuments to institutions we may not support, guardians of beauty created through systems of exploitation we would condemn. The palace stands as a testament to human capacity for creation and for cruelty, for vision and for vanity, for the sublime and for the brutal mechanics that make sublimity possible. In the end, the palace of the popes survives not on its own merits, but through continuous human decision and effort. Admiration alone preserves nothing. Beauty alone guarantees nothing. Stone, however magnificent, decays without care. What keeps the palace standing is the same thing that built it, the willingness of people to devote resources and labor to sustaining something larger than themselves, something that will outlast them, something that makes a claim on the future. Whether that claim is worth honoring, whether the costs are justified, whether preservation serves human flourishing or merely serves itself, these questions admit no definitive answers. They must be asked and answered anew by each generation that inherits the palace and the burden of its preservation. The palace will stand as long as enough people believe it should, as long as resources can be found, as long as the invisible systems of labor and money and sacrifice continue to operate. When those systems fail, the palace will begin its slow return to the earth from which it was carved. But for now, on this particular morning, as light climbs the eastern walls and tourists gather in the courtyard, the palace of the popes still stands. The stone is still cold. The shadows are still deep. And somewhere in the basements and workshops and offices, people whose names you will never know are working to keep it standing for another day, another year, another century. Their labor is invisible, their sacrifice unremarked. But without them, all of this, all of the beauty, all of the history, all of the grandeur would be nothing but dust and memory within a single lifetime.